One of the most common questions that I receive is how do I organize my Figma files? And the short answer is that there isn't any one right answer. The key is consistency. As long as other people on your team can expect where things should live in your system, you're gonna be fine. That being said, I've been using a setup for years now that I think works pretty well, and so I'm gonna walk you through how it works now. Let's dive in. Now, in order to explain how I think about organizing my files in Figma, I have 5 primary goals that I use to kind of guide how I think about where things go and how I can set developers up for success. So the first one of these goals is everything that engineers see should be relevant and directly related to what they'll be building. And what I mean by that is, as designers, we go off and we make these huge mess of things. We explore, we try all of these different combinations of UI, and then developers only build a small subset of what we actually create in Figma. So what I try to do is create a clear separation between my exploratory work and then work that is actually ready to build. And I do that by using 2 different files for this approach. And those 2 different files are shaping and production. That's how I refer to them. And in the shaping file, this is where I'm getting really messy. I'm throwing a bunch of paint at the wall. And then once I get to the point where I have sign off from stakeholders, I feel good about at least the vast majority of my UI where I want to actually start working on the implementation with engineering, then I will take that UI and I will move it into the relevant production file. So you'll notice here that these are 2 separate Figma projects, one for shaping and one for production. But they actually have the same names of the files themselves. Like there's a CLP editor in both of these. So what I'm doing is I'm doing all of my exploratory work here in this shaping file, and then I will pull out what we are actually going to commit to building, and I'll move that into the production file up here. And so whenever I loop engineers into the process, I'm inside of a production file, and that way they can be sure that every single thing that they are seeing in Figma is relevant to what they're supposed to build. Now, what also works really well here is if you have a project for production and a project for shaping, you can export the production files as libraries. So all of the components in the CLP editor, for instance, I can actually publish as a library and then import that into the relevant shaping file. So that way, as I'm doing new explorations and working on new features, I can very easily pull in all of the most relevant components from my production file and then break them apart and rework them in the shaping file. So that is the first core idea that I use to think about my file organization. The second is that I want to primarily group things by flows, which really just means that I want to organize my files around the user journey. And so it's pretty simple how I'll do that. I'll move horizontally across the page, and then I use this little title component here from Handoff Helpers to actually put it above each of the flows. And I might add a little note component too to describe the flow and add any relevant documentation. But at a high level, the starting point for how I think about file organization is I want things to be grouped by flows, and I will move horizontally across my page as I'm moving from one flow to the next. Now from there, I want to make sure that it's really easy to see all of the potential variations that any given screen can take. And when I say that, I'm not necessarily referring to individual component states. I can add that documentation at the component level. I'm talking about screens themselves. So the fundamental layout of a page is changing. That is something that I do want to represent as a separate frame. And I'll do so by putting it underneath the frame that it is a variation of. So in the naming scheme that I highlighted here, where I go name long dash modifier hyphen submodifier, this could be something like checkout coupon, and then here is the page when there's an error message from that coupon, and I'll stack that below. So we're still moving left to right across the flow. I wouldn't want to put this up here because it's not a core part of the flow. It's just a potential variation of this one individual screen. So the main building blocks we have right now for file organization are we're moving horizontally with flows, and then variations of a screen go below that screen. Now the next goal is I want to make it very easy for developers to know how every screen responds at a given breakpoint. And how I will do that is within a flow, I will move vertically across breakpoints. So maybe I have web up here, tablet in the middle, and then below that, I'll add mobile. And then in front of each of these flows, I'll add some kind of a note component here, where I'll add details on the different responsive logic, maybe max widths, any relevant links. Perhaps there's even like a Notion document or a Google document that describes some details or the backstory behind a given flow. Anything that can help developers get context and not have to bounce around different tools, I'll put it directly into this component right here. Now let's say you have a flow with 10 different screens. What I don't think you have to do is recreate those same 10 screens across every single breakpoint. That starts to get overkill. It's making your files more bloated. It's actually harder to navigate for engineers. So the way that I think about it is only recreate screens that have a unique layout for that specific breakpoint. So if I have 10 screens in a flow, I might only have to recreate 2 or 3 of them for tablet and mobile in order to be able to give developers the full picture for how something responds. Make sure you're not doing work that is unnecessary. And I'll talk about this a little bit later when we go through an actual example file. Now the last goal is I want to clearly document all of the components that I'm using in my designs. And that refers to both components that I'm importing from other files as well as local components that I'm creating just for this specific flow or area of the product that I'm designing for. So there's kind of 2 ways that I'll think about this. Let's say that I'm importing a design system component and using it in a given flow. This could be a series of switches, drop-downs, anything like that. What I'll probably do is in this note attached to the beginning of the flow, I'll actually include a relevant link and point to the Figma component that I am referencing. And for some things, this might not be necessary. For instance, with a button. By the time a developer implements a button for the 100th time, they probably don't need to reference it back in Figma because that's already built. But there's often this middle ground where they might not visually recognize that something is part of the design system. And what I don't want to do is rely on them having to go into the inspect panel, recognize that this is a main component, and then know to click back to the original library. Instead, I'll make sure that I'm over communicating which design system components I'm using, and then I'll explicitly link to those within the component itself. And this is all baked into my handoff helpers library. Okay, so the second way that I think about this is I know that I'm also going to have a bunch of components that are specific to this flow only. They're not being imported in from a library, and I'm just using them throughout this set of screens. For all of those components, I actually create a separate page just to keep them organized and have a place for all of the documentation to live. I like using the link emoji. I've been doing that since Sketch and it feels nice. You can really do whatever you want. Again, the only thing that matters is just be consistent so that developers know where to look to access all of these components. And then I'll have some kind of a component frame that I use consistently throughout all my designs that'll include the name, any documentation, for instance, just outlining the different states and maybe a little bit of behavior or anything that doesn't feel very intuitive. And then I'll have my actual variants below with all of the components. This level of granularity in terms of the handoff process, I think that it can actually make the main page overwhelming. And so anything related to component states and component architecture, I separate out from the flow and put it in its own page. All right. The next step is I've duplicated a file that I've been working on recently, and I've included it in this lesson, and I'm going to go through it quickly, but hopefully it gives you a good sense of how I apply these goals and what it can actually look like in a real file. So if I click into this file here, the first thing you'll notice is that I actually add a table of contents as the first page in each one of my files. And this came out of a little interview process that I did with the engineers that I work with, where I was kind of doing almost like a retro and figuring out what is most helpful, where are the blockers, where are the bottlenecks that we can make better. And one of the main pieces of feedback that I was receiving is it's not super clear what is actively being worked on versus what is supposed to match code, and where those differences between the two states lie. And so what I did to alleviate that is I started breaking things up into production and in progress. And you can see that this matches these emojis here on the left, where I'll use a check mark to denote what is actively in production, and then a construction emoji for what we are currently working on. And so what I do as the table of contents is just give you a really quick high-level overview of this section of the product and where we are at in the process. What's in code, what are we working on, and then what are the relevant components. And I simply insert this TOC component at the beginning of each one of my new files. So let's look at the production pages first, and we can get a sense for how I'm laying out the content. Right away, you'll notice that there's these two flows here. And then beneath the flows, I'm showing how the actual designs respond at each given breakpoint. And you'll see this has base states. That's a pretty common thing that I'll do, because a lot of times there is a set of foundational UI that might not be tied to a specific flow, but I want to communicate that. And oftentimes that's where it makes sense to work through the different breakpoints as well. Because over here, this is actually showing me applying a discount code. That is a very specific user journey that I'm documenting. Here are just all of the different states that this modal can take. And you'll notice within each breakpoint, I have my little note component here where I'm documenting everything about how these panels respond. And then I'll even add little GIFs here. This is the CleanShot tool that I use all the time. I highly recommend investing in it. It's a very easy way to create super simple GIFs to capture these specific little interactions without requiring developers to actually enter into prototype mode. So this page follows the walkthrough in the slides pretty closely. We're working through flows, working down through breakpoints. And that's actually the same thing if I go over to this page here. I have a set of base states. There's really only two main states that this page can take, and then I'll show how everything responds moving down. And if we look at one more page here, this is the applications. This one is work in progress. So the first thing that you'll notice is that I have way more screens up at this desktop breakpoint than I do at tablet and mobile. And this gets back to that idea that I mentioned in the slides. Don't feel like you need to replicate every single screen for every breakpoint. You're going to end up doing a lot of unnecessary work. All I need to do is show how does this application modal respond. If I can communicate the max width and the different resizing logic, everything else inside of it for this specific use case is quite intuitive and it doesn't change. So I'm not going to waste my time designing it. Instead, I'm just going to show how the different base states respond. And then if we move in here, you can see that the core flow is I'm just moving across these pages, going from question to question until I'm at the success state here. But then within each individual page, I'll show the different variations that that page can take. So for instance here, all I'm doing is showing how the progress bar is tied to individual questions, and then what this looks like if it's filled out, and then finally what the potential error messaging could be if you try to skip a required question. Hopefully that all makes sense by now. The only other thing that I will touch on that wasn't explicitly listed in the goals, but I do think it is pretty important, is once you ship a feature, it's almost inevitable that you're going to have some round of smaller improvements based off of the feedback that you get from your end users. And the way that I think about organizing that is I'll actually create a separate page maybe it'll say V2, maybe it'll say something like checkout improvements. And what I do is I use these note components here to kick off a set of changes. So I'm moving vertically across changes. This is a set of changes. This is a set of changes, so on and so forth down the page. Now, there's a couple of things that I'm doing that are super helpful in my opinion. One is I'm actually going to link to the relevant task or issue that the developer is working off of. So for our team at Maven, we use Linear. It's awesome software. And so I will go in and grab the link to the Linear issue and then add it to my note component so that the developers can very easily confirm which chunks of UI relate to which ticket that they're working off of. And then in here, I'll add any relevant helper text, notes, maybe I'll ask questions, anything like that that I think could help the developers. And then the other thing is I'll use these notes to communicate the state of a given ticket. So you'll notice up here it says ready to build. Pretty intuitive. Down here, I might write something like needs review. And this is just a way to communicate to engineers that maybe this one is not 100% ready to start writing code for. We probably need some kind of a checkpoint. If I'm going to say needs review, I'm almost always going to ask some kind of a question, and then I'll just simply link to this specific card here, and I can just send that to developers, and they're able to see the UI, see what I'm thinking about, and then read any questions that I have about the ticket that they're working off of. So hopefully this makes it all a little bit more tangible by seeing an example of how I would go about organizing my files. The last piece of advice that I'll leave you with is treat your developers like a different kind of user that you are designing for. They have a user journey just like the people who are using your product. They're going into Figma, trying to figure out what is what, where they're supposed to look. And so I'll actually make a point to interview them and ask, how are things going? Where are your bottlenecks? What can I make easier? Treat them like a user, and you'll uncover all of these different insights that's going to help your team work more efficiently. And ultimately, you're going to ship better product, and that's what matters.